The buzzkill is here. We are about to start. So, there are a few things to be said. First of all, again, heartfelt thanks to Heritage, because this convivial atmosphere, our having, a chance to eat and chat together, in addition to coming together to hear each other, talk to each other, meet new people, etc. Heritage provides the context for that, and it's really a wonderful thing to, in effect, be given half the gallery space for 2 days for this event. And I just want to express my thanks once again, because it may seem like, oh, well, they have the space, why not? But it's really extremely generous, and we're very grateful to them, and very grateful for their commitment to American art. And there's a bunch of interesting stuff, so please look around if you haven't had a chance to do so already. Now, some further housekeeping. I have a Lombardy Hotel room key. If you don't need it, that's fine. We'll throw it out at the end. We're not collecting ephemera yet. That may be next year's conference. But if it is something that you need or want, I have it in my left pocket. Next, if you signed up to go to the American Art Fair this evening, this event at Bohemian National Hall, so the opening is this evening, and that was part of the, what was sent out to everybody. Please see Erin, who has your ticket. So, and so right there with the tote bags, the person who keeps the universe working. So that is about this evening, and please see her for your tickets. For those of you that are just arriving and perhaps don't yet have a copy of American Fine Art or want an additional copy, there are copies on the book table. Please feel free to take them. And please, we are so grateful for the relationship we have with them, and, how we can, together continue to hopefully challenge, beguile, and engage as many people as possible. On a more granular level, there is a book table that was very thoughtfully planned, if you will, by Larry List, who has several publications there. Does somebody have a program? Because I don't, and I'm sorry to be standing up here like this, but David, can I have one? Thanks. Thank you so much, Hannah. So anyway, he was very thoughtful about providing it. There's also a copy of Mark Nelson's book there. We really do believe no books, no culture, thank you, we die. And we used to have this wonderful bookseller. This is something we are striving to return to. Larry, I commit to you, I will not give up. It may sound like it's an easy thing to do, but honestly, things are, on the one hand, so particularized, and on the other hand, so generalized, that when you actually start talking about something in specific, there are complications that, you actually never really thought about, that people manage to come up with. Now, once again, thank you all. So this afternoon, we are starting with a talk on Jack Damer, Roger Anliker, and we have a newly coined term, the 20th century inside, two 20th century, quote, inside outsiders. And Larry has been interested in these two artists, and it is an interest that complements something about which you've heard from him before, which is Man Ray and chess, and but then also not to forget, because George Orr was raised during the context of this conference, and last year Larry was in conversation about George Orr, who was an absolutely manic genius whose ceramics presaged all kinds of things. But we go from one kind of crazy universe into another, and I'm really grateful to have been approached with this idea by Larry. And so it's a pleasure to introduce him, turn it over to him, and I am sure have him expand our minds.
Hi. The microphone is on. That's good. I speak of whom I know in that sort of as an undergraduate studio major, I got to study with Roger Anliker for a year. And then little did I know, he recommended me to the University of Wisconsin, and I studied there for 3 years with Jack Damer. And so yesterday we went the whole way to Western Landscape and Vision, and this afternoon we'll only go as far as the Midwest. But how are we supposed to treat the legacies of artists who became insider-outsiders, by which they were artists who trained in the finest art schools, had budding professional careers, but then they abandoned any connection with the commercial gallery world in order to pursue their personal work without any of the pressures and restraints imposed by the marketplace, to pursue pure visual research and share it through mentorship and pedagogy. They were insiders in terms of their sophistication, but became self-imposed outsiders by their refusal to engage with the market system's discourse. Hence, they received scant recognition retrospectively. So how might their legacies be appreciated or renewed or reviewed? Now, two of the artists were Roger Anliker and Jack Damer, and they were sort of linked. Anliker was born in Akron, Ohio in 1924 to parents of Swiss descent. He was a voracious reader and a budding artist from his childhood. Like many creative spirits, though, growing up in Midwest towns, he was entranced by forms of the romantic and exotic that he actually got to encounter. In his case, the circus. And so he studied tap dance, acrobatics, and he aspired to be a circus performer initially. He even took summer jobs feeding the elephants when the circus came to town. And though a romantic, his Midwestern and Swiss sense of practicality led him to set his sights on becoming a designer or illustrator, not initially a fine artist. And so here are some of his first works when he entered Cleveland School of Art, later the Cleveland Institute. He was only 17 and he had won a full scholarship already. And in the next 2 years, he distinguished himself with additional awards in the annual sort of Cleveland Independent Show and a prize from the Academy in Rome for collaborative design. Now, like many working class artists of this generation, Anliker's introduction to Europe and European art was by way of a 3-year stint in the army during World War II. And he served as a map maker and illustrator in a combat company that moved through France, Germany, and Czechoslovakia until the end of the war. He was held over as part of the post-war occupation, and that gave him the opportunity to visit the Louvre and also to attend courses at the American University in Biarritz, France, before returning to the US. And when he returned to the Cleveland School of Art, he was given a full Gund fellowship for all of his expenses. Pre-war, watercolorist Henry Keller had been his primary influence, as Keller had been previously on Charles Birchfield. Post-World War II, K. Dorn Cass and Carl Gaitner became his major influences. Now, Anliker, born talented, attained virtuoso level mastery, even as an undergraduate, of all the traditional drawing media, watercolor, gouache, tempera, casein, oil painting, and even encaustic, which is especially challenging. He transformed Midwest landscapes into eerie moonlit nocturnes like this Firefly or Thoughts of Flight. And he won prestigious awards at the Cleveland May shows, and at only age 24, he was honored with solo shows at both the 1030 Gallery in Cleveland and the Akron Art Institute. In addition, the Jacques Seligman Gallery in New York included his work in traveling shows with the promise of a one-man show in New York. All of this, plus immediate offers of teaching jobs from Oberlin, Colby College, Carnegie Mellon, and others flowed in. And unfortunately, this bred a sense of hubris in the young Anliker, who then embarrassingly tried to dictate the gallery installation of his work at the Akron Art Institute. This soured the relations with them and also killed all the opportunities for purchases by collectors. It also planted in Anliker the first seeds of discontent with having to deal with galleries and other people telling him what to do or how his work should be displayed. He chose to teach at Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh, and he did so from 1948 to 1963. There he became renowned for teaching drawing classes that were both rigorous technically on the one hand and incredibly imaginative on the other hand. And his own work originated in the realm of magic realism, but it evolved into uncharted and unchartable extreme forms of figuration and abstraction. One of his maxims became, an artist is someone who's extravagant with time. And the dates on many of his paintings, you will see, indicate that he worked on the works and reworked them to perfection over periods of months or even years. While at Carnegie, Anliker received a Guggenheim Fellowship. He had 3 solo shows at Jacques Seligman in New York, 2 shows, retrospectives, at the Carnegie Institute and Museum, and another at the Akron Art Institute, as well as the Westmoreland Museum. His work appeared in 2 Carnegie Internationals, as well as other museum shows nationally and internationally. So his star was ascending. But he increasingly became a contrarian, and he explained, if everybody's painting large, loose, and fast, well, I'm going to paint small, slow, and tight. And so a typical Anliker image is like that one that is 12 by 9 inches, on which he probably worked for months. At Carnegie, he was an influential teacher on such diverse talents as figurative artist Philip Guston, or rather Philip Pearlstein, pop artist Andy Warhol, feminist Joyce Kozloff, and conceptual artists Mel Bachner and Jonathan Borofsky, as well as mentoring the young Jack Damer, of whom we'll speak later. The breadth of his influence is not surprising, in that beyond the technical things of which he was a master, Anliker focused his students intensely on generating new ways to work and to think about art making. Things like, and I have been tasked with these things myself in his class, draw the model as if you were a different animal species, maybe a bumblebee or an elephant. If you're going to do something natural, try to do it in an unnatural way. Show your subjects, but also show them as if you're seeing them through other things, veils, mists, fogs, or translucencies. He would often sort of have an ascot of a translucent sort of silk or material, and he'd just take it off in the middle of analyzing your drawing, and he would put it over part of it, and he says, okay, see how radically this has changed? You know, sort of from what it was in its dramatic sense, and then sort of once you throw a veil over it, you can create a whole different atmosphere and stuff. And, you know, it's draw an activity, but don't draw a bicycle, draw the experience of riding a bike, which in my experience was much harder to do. He taught that you didn't draw only with pens and pencils and charcoal and brushes, but also with rags, sponges, blotters, and erasers equally. And then he would challenge you, like, how don't you draw? Well, try drawing like that for a while. He always tried to get you to go beyond who you already were to discover who you might become. Now, here are examples of whatever works will work in reverse, another of his maxims. And on the left-hand side there, you see that instead of drawing white lines on black paper, what he did was he sort of filled in the negative spaces around where he wanted white lines to end up being. And he filled them in with black washes. And so, okay, well, it's a white contour line drawing, but the effect is quite different than had he just simply sort of drawn with, you know, white ink or paint on black. Or he would do things like do half of a painting sort of drawing with black on top of a white ground, and then sort of reverse the ground to being a black ground and draw the rest of it or paint the rest of it with white on top of black. And so the effect sort of became sort of like a switcheroo kind of thing. Now, another of the many techniques that he developed and shared with students was drawing in ink or watercolor, then immediately blotting the lines, so that instead of having the look of a hand-drawn line, you would have this eerie feeling that you're looking at something that already had been reproduced or already printed. And here's sort of how that worked. The blotted line technique is sort of on the right. You have a non-absorbent paper like tracing paper or glassine. On the left, you have hinge, a piece of absorbent like rag paper. And then you would start drawing in ink or pen sort of on the non-absorbent side, throw on sort of some more accents and stuff with brush and ink. And then you would hinge over the absorbent paper and blot it, unfold it, and you have a perfect mirror image of this blotted version of the drawing. And then to that, you could add text if you wanted to add text. Now, the blotted line technique could also be used, like in the upper sort of right, we have, there's the basic drawing. You could blot multiple copies, then hand color them in, and suddenly you have 3 or 4 what all look like hand-drawn original drawings, but very quickly, and to offer sort of many variations of the things. Now, this blotted line technique became the distinctive early signature style of Anliker student Andy Warhol in his lucrative New York illustration career. And it became the conceptual basis of Warhol's subsequent production of paintings by hand painting colors onto a canvas and then silk screening over a photo silk screen of a portrait or another subject, in this case, flowers or electric chairs. And, you know, here we have Andy sort of and Gerard Malanga silk screening on the floor of their studio called The Factory. And this enabled Warhol to produce multiple iterations of a single subject, just as he earlier on in his illustration work did multiple sort of shoe illustrations. Now, In 1963, Anliker accepted a full professorship at Tyler School of Art, which is where I ended up encountering him. He was head of the painting department. He was full professor at the Tyler School in Rome, won distinguished teaching awards, was given multiple sort of research sabbaticals, and the capstone of his career, a Lifetime Achievement Award. He continued to perfect works that he had begun at Carnegie, like this one, Rain, Pale Hepatica, which he worked on from 1958 to 1964. And he did works like this Eye of the Dragonfly, which is only 21 by 29 inches. That's about life size or maybe even larger. But here's a detail of it. That's a 5 by 7 inch detail. And I wish Chris Walther was here, because I took him to the Anliker Foundation. He saw this and he could attest to the fact that more than any other artist I've ever encountered, Anliker's work, even in reproduction and good high-res things, you're only seeing about 15% of the amount of detail that he puts into things. And so they're truly remarkable works to experience. And interestingly, he loved the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop. And sort of a poetry critic, Jory Graham, wrote a beautiful description of Bishop's language. And it also aptly fits Anliker's work. All are shines, gleams, and reflections. All things opaque become iridescent, then translucent. Surfaces yield depths, materiality yields immateriality. And so, while many of Anliker's drawings, or rather his students, were headed off to New York as soon as they graduated, another of his talented proteges, Jack Damer, ended up heading instead further Midwest to Wisconsin instead. And John Fielding Damer was born the only child in Pittsburgh, 1938, to a railroad brakeman, John Damer, a Polish immigrant who died of kidney cancer very violently when his son was only in second grade. And his mother, Ruth Schimmel, was an English immigrant and homemaker who later sort of remarried. A formative thing in Damer's life was this model train set, which each year father and son would enlarge and add to. And this sort of forged Damer's fascination, not with the circus, but instead with the industrial landscape of machine-age Pittsburgh. Damer's earliest drawings weren't of people, they weren't of nature, they weren't of flowers or teddy bears or anything like that, but instead trains, fighter planes, and by the time he was in high school, firearms. Comic books were his first drawing teachers, and they were the introduction to his lifelong passions for science, technology, as well as images of warfare and violence. And as soon as Damer could drive, he traded his interest in model trains to an interest in hot rod cars, and he became a member of the Winders Hot Rod Club. Now, in his environment, sort of in the early 50s in Pittsburgh, where I grew up as well, it wasn't regarded as a very sort of manly thing to do to want to sort of go to art class and draw things. But if you could pinstripe a car, suddenly you had cred. And if you could sort of tear apart an engine, you were somebody and you became part of a community. And this is very important to Damer, especially because he was an only child. And he found an intersection of high and low art in garages and junkyards. And he even added, when I interviewed him, he says, the smell of oil, grease, and gasoline was a dominant figure in my memory. This is like Proust's Madeleine. Instead, it was kerosene, oil, and gasoline. Now, Damer applied to Carnegie Tech, and he didn't know what to do. And so, well, what would his high school art rival, Chuck Schmidt, doing? Well, Chuck Schmidt was applying to Carnegie. So, okay, if he can do it, I'll do it too. So he was accepted. And like Anliker and Warhol before him, Damer sort of decided to major in commercial art because it was the practical choice, with the best notions of getting a job. So it was a mixture at that point of the Beaux-Arts education and the Bauhaus sort of education. And so sort of he had one foot in each world throughout his education. And fortunately for Damer, the faculty were very well suited. His first drawing teacher did precisionist railroad and factory imageries. And then Robert Lepper sort of did mechanical imagery and components in his own paintings and sculptures. Lepper also established the first industrial design program in an American art school. And so that was important, sort of like bolstering Damer's sort of interest in machines. And in his classes, Lepper focused students on the dynamics between images and their psychological or their deeper meanings. Though for Damer, what that meant was drawing his favorite subject matter, motorcycles and hot rods. At Carnegie, Damer explained to me, drawing wasn't a thing. It was everything. It was everything. And it was the whole point of why I was there. I had the idea that if I learned to draw better than anybody else, I'd be a good artist. And Damer had the good fortune of having Roger Anliker for his upper level drawing instructor. And he said Anliker demonstrated techniques, but he talked about art and culture. He was professional in his demeanor, and he was impeccable in his dress. And I later learned when I studied with Anliker, he designed all of his own clothes and had them custom made. He picked the fabrics and everything. He imbued students with a desire to perform at the highest level. Anliker taught by example. He had his own studio in the art building, and he worked there days, evenings, weekends, and he made himself available to students beyond just class hours. Sophomore year, a change came over Damer because he had his first printmaking course. And he fell in love with printmaking and the tactile, wonderful, seductive qualities of ink and paper. And as a printmaking major, Damer had two more exceptional professors. Joan Meyer did engravings with translucent meshes of shimmering, undulating lines that end up recurring repeatedly in Damer's later work. And Robert Gardner was, like Damer, a tech head. And he researched early lithographic techniques, equipment, processes. He was very professional, Damer said, intense, and he seemed to have all the answers. Damer immediately fell in love with the idea of working in a print studio. It was a factory-like workplace, not an effete atelier. And he could use a car-sized machine, a lithopress, to make his art. The scent memory of the solvents transported him back to the Winder's hot rod garage. So just like Proust with the Madeleine. Students worked with metals, sewn, chemicals, and potentially dangerous machinery. And it was communal, not a solitary creative environment. Students had their own projects, but they also helped each other. And they combined drawing with the factory-like physical labor of printing. And having worked as an edition printer, I can tell you it's as physical as when I worked in a steel mill. But anyway, Damer's senior year, the Vietnam War was escalating. And so Anliker encouraged him to enlist in the Army Reserves, which he did. And after graduation, with his knowledge of anatomy, aptitude for 3D visualization, fine motor skills, and the ability to quickly diagnose problems, Damer was trained to be a medic. And he was also trained in the art of camouflage, which he also later incorporated in his image making. And then after his reserve training, and then a stint at a graphic job working at the CIA in Washington, during which he prepared all of John Kennedy's briefing books. during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That when he was told that he couldn't use any of the portfolio pieces he prepared because everything was classified, he resigned. He says, "What? I can't use any of this stuff to get a job?" And so he bailed on that, and he ended up going back to Pittsburgh, and he applied to grad school and was given a fellowship. Now, Carnegie at the time was in the thrall of figurative expressionism, and so Damer just plugged into that style to begin with and ran through the gamut of the latest litho techniques, the newest inks, zinc and aluminum lithoplates in addition to stone lithography, and all the procedures that Professor Gardner brought back from the Tamarind Institute in New Mexico, which was now being run by his old classmate, Garo Antresian. Gardner communicated to Damer, in his words, the intensity of the craft and how to run a professional shop. He gave Damer a profound sense of what to expect in the life of an artist. Damer also became friends with future filmmaker George Romero and a Carnegie sort of group of photo buffs from whom he learned darkroom developing and printing. He then photographed drama students for money, and he made posters for university film societies, and at that point became an avid, lifelong film goer. Now, with his camera, he took this informal self-portrait photo reflected in a mirror, and this led to an epiphany. Now, to the left of this mirror frame is not a Playboy centerfold, but instead a car magazine pinup of a Shelby Cobra sports car, at the time the hottest car going. The centerfold was a large mechanical exploded drawing akin to many that Damer himself would use over the years in his imagery. The photograph captured Damer at this important moment of self-discovery. He was reflected in and he was reflecting upon the core subject matter of his future career, the beauty of advanced technology and mechanical imagery. After this, Damer spent day and night in the studio turning out lithographs and drawings that celebrated engines and machines as trophies or portrayed them as the wreckage of industrial landscapes. Just like sort of Dawn's landscapes, beautiful nostalgic landscapes dotted with, you know, uranium mines and gas stations, etc. And the reception of Damer's MFA show of all of this industrial subject matter was not super at Carnegie, but his technical mastery and his know-how concerning all the commercial printing and photo processes won him a job at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, teaching lithography. And lo and behold, Damer replaced a very special person, Alfred Sessler. And Sessler was a social realist who became a magic realist, and he invented reduction block woodcut printing. He set up the Madison print department, and he began the collection of fine art prints at the university, and their collection now numbers over 80,000. But even once he started it up, they had the largest collection of fine art prints from Schongauer and Dürer forward in the country. Sessler set in motion the American print renaissance that, for instance, Marty O'Brien is so interested in. And it ran from the 40s through the 70s. And other central figures were the multi-plate color etcher Warrington Colescott, Dean Meeker, who in the 1940s first adapted commercial silkscreen printing into fine art prints, wood engraver Roy Gleckler, and a book and paper maker, Walter Hamady. Replacing Sessler, Damer had become the bookend, the final member of that era of pioneering American artist printmakers in the Midwest. And on his arrival, he had to immediately build a new litho studio in a previous education building. And then just 3 years later, he had to build another studio in the newly completed Humanities Art Building. And he modeled the new studio after the professional studios at Tamarind Lithography Workshop in New Mexico. And that studio became the state-of-the-art model for litho studios in American art schools for decades. He taught both undergrad and graduate litho, as well as drawing and anatomy. And he also managed to have time to send prize-winning works to national print shows. And while the 1968 litho studio was being built, he had nowhere to work. He did a whole series of etchings called the Silence series. And this marked another significant juncture in his career. After this series, he decided not to establish a signature style. And he abandoned the idea of a pursuit of an art career centered on making suites or portfolios of related images to exhibit or to sell through commercial galleries as the conduit for his ideas. Like his Carnegie mentor, Anliker, Damer reasoned, I had a full-time job and income that allowed me to take risks with my work, so I abandoned making work with any thought of public acceptance. And by this time, Damer and fellow professor Bill Wigge had installed and were using and teaching their students to use, more importantly, all the commercial offset plate lithography equipment. Copy camera, you could put anything in that copy frame, photograph it, and make it into a halftone screen, or even do color separations. And so suddenly, you could make images of anything. Like Bob Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol in New York around this same time, Damer and Wigge had begun what I'm terming the take a picture to make a picture generation. Now, only occasionally was man ever included in Damer's imagery. Only when technological sort of role was played, as in this image of an astronaut called the four-stroke man. And here, Damer sort of exercised this thing, I'm not going to make sort of like related images for showing. Instead, I'm going to experiment and see what are all the permutations I can do to an image. So first there's this airbrush sort of like photo sort of lithograph of the astronaut. And then he uses regular stone lithography to do a reversal where all the values are reversed. Then he uses a radical sort of screen tone sort of manipulation to transform that same image radically again. He aspired, as he said, to copy images and make them his own by changing and combining the different environments and settings. He collaged images. Where are we here? He collaged images from some of his favorite reading material, which was sort of car part catalogs. And he collaged them into obvious sort of photolithographs like this, which is entitled the J.C. Whitney's catalog, the J.C. Whitney lithograph, or very sort of covert sort of photo collages that he then would draw back into, like this one called Floaters. And also sort of, he printed the whole thing, and then over it, there are three different translucent color veils. So the thing, as per Anliker's sort of thing, sort of submerge it, you know, see it through a mesh, see it through a transparency. And Damer sort of like put these lessons to great use. Now, he showcased his work in the expanding network of national and international print exhibitions. And he barnstormed the United States. He was young, he was single, he had either a motorcycle or a Corvette Stingray. And so he barnstormed the United States, doing more than 60 visiting artist, guest printer events. And because he wasn't trying to show in a gallery or something, he would generously show everybody all the new techniques that he had figured out, rather than other people were, well, this is my signature technique, so I'm not going to tell you how I did it. It's a secret. You know, no, Damer sort of said, here's how you do it. You can do it, I can do it, we can all do it, you know, make your imagery. And so thanks to Damer's training and his barnstorming, many of his students went on to have successful careers in New York as artists, and he placed countless others in professional print studios and in college art departments. In fact, at one graphics conference, uh, I was told that the Wisconsin people were having their little reunion, and a person from another school burst in and said, "So you're the Wisconsinites. We're just going to have to wait until you all die so that the rest of us can get jobs." And they had a very pervasive and fruitful sort of network nationwide. Now, if this wasn't enough, Damer was a very energetic guy, and so he immediately, when he got to Wisconsin, saw that the Wisconsin sort of had a very active program of getting visiting artists from California or from New York in to sort of visit and lecture. And so he thought, well, I'm going to ask them, invite them to the print studio, draw on a stone, draw on a plate, and I'll print you an edition. So he and his graduate students got experience sort of doing edition printing. The artists loved it because they went home with a free edition. And the students got experience seeing how real working artists worked. And so it was a win-win-win. And he printed editions for Alice Neal, William T. Wiley, Alan Shields, Roy DeForest, and a boatload of other people. And he created this thing of, it was a status perk in New York if you could say, well, I got invited to Wisconsin to make a print. And so, it just sort of was a win-win-win all the way around. And Damer got visiting artists who wanted to screen print or do experimental papermaking to work with his fellow teacher, Bill Wiggy, who had the Jones Road print shop. And then Damer and Wiggy sort of approached the UW faculty, the department, and they said, why don't you guys fund this and we'll merge all of this? And so the merger was Tandem Press, which 30-some years later is still thriving and is a much sought out place by artists all over the country to get to go and make a print. Now, Damer, with all these initiatives, word of him reached Washington, D.C., of all places. And the curators of the U.S. State Pavilion at the Venice Biennale approached Damer, and they invited him to be the director of the U.S. Print Workshop. They wanted him to set up a complete workshop, the Biennale, and the central focus of the American Pavilion was going to be the brilliance of the American print renaissance. And so Damer was supposed to invite a few of his other creative cronies, and then the State Department was going to invite other major American artists to come and do a print on site. And of the many projects, the most innovative and memorable was Ed Ruscha's Chocolate Room. And they wondered, well, Ed, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? He says, well, I'm going to go to lunch, and I'll be back later. And so 2 days before he was scheduled to leave, he said, I bought up all the chocolate syrup there is in Venice, and I have like 3 reams of rag paper, and I want you to silk screen 360 sheets of this rag paper with the chocolate sauce. And then we're going to cover the entire room, which they did. And it created an overwhelming visual and sensory experience that people still talk about. And since then, it is so legendary that it has been reproduced 4 more times at various museums around the world. But anyway, once Damer got back, he continued his take a picture to make a picture philosophy to include creating extreme versions of other artists' artwork. Drawing from the UW print collection, he took Martin Schongauer's Death of the Virgin, and he converted it into a photolitho, and then he worked through 3 or 4 different options of it, calling his exercise the Fog Morn. He also sort of took a Hogarth of strolling actresses dressing in a barn and created a whole thing of his own with that as an image basis sort of to spark his work. Now, he did this with a number of other things, quite a while. And there was one student in particular who spent her entire undergraduate and graduate career from 1965 to 1973 in Wisconsin's print department during this take a picture to make a picture photomechanical boom. And that person was Sherry Levine. And Sherry Levine learned black and white photography, used the copy camera to make photo negatives and positives, and like Damer and Warhol both, she earned money by doing commercial graphic artwork. And she said that I was really interested in how the commercial artists deal with this idea of originality. I found that if they wanted an image, they'd just take it. It was never an issue of morality. It was always an issue of utility. There was no sense that images belonged to anybody. All the images were in the public domain for me, and as an artist, I found that very, very heartening. So Levine took this laissez-faire approach that the commercial artists had, combined it with Damer's, you take a picture to make a picture, and she sort of made that into her art practice, later identified by critics and writers as appropriation art. She decided that she could take works from other artists in the pantheon of modernism, represent them as her own works, just as Damer had done, in Damer's words, by changing their context and presentation. Damer's work, made from multiple drawings composited over each other, sparked Levine's desire to put a picture on top of a picture. So there are times when both pictures disappear, and there are times where they're both present. The vibration is basically what the work's all about to me. And these are the source images that Damer used in creating these different things. And so you see that, sort of the images appear, they disappear, they mesh together, and all like that. And that sort of was all sort of embedded in Sherry Levine's young, fertile mind before she left Wisconsin. It's like, Damer and his rework Schongauer and historical images demonstrated to Levine the potential for images or objects to be transmuted from one form to another. So following Damer's initiative of exploiting the latest technology, Levine went on to use digital pixel averaging algorithms to execute her cathedral series by dematerializing Impressionist Claude Monet's Rouen cathedral facades into sample swatches, average sample swatches, and then also her After Cézanne landscapes by building blunt, chiseled, prismatic, color average brushstrokes. And she arrived at having a figural image embedded almost imperceptibly into a very abstract color grid pattern. She even, as a tribute to Damer and his industrial roots in Pittsburgh, she even did a series sort of after Feininger, where she reappropriated these industrial landscape photos of a series that Feininger did. And they were described by Douglas Crimp as they were landscapes that had been intruded upon and despoiled by industry. And they were taken from the 1972 textbook, Basic Color Photography, which Levine had probably studied before she left in 1973. So just like Anliker provided the blotted line technique that laid the foundation for Warhol's later work, Damer's take a picture to make a picture practice eventually led Levine to her approach of appropriation art. Anliker and Damer's research and pedagogy provided the conceptual grounding that made these Warhol and Levine images possible. Though their signatures are not on these works, Anliker and Damer's fingerprints are certainly clear. So what are the contributions that Damer and Anliker did make? Well, they each produced an impressive body of highly original work. They developed major new technical approaches, and they freely shared them with others. That's a big difference than most people. Each was a brain trust of creative insights and ideas that laid foundation for successful, innovative careers of their proteges like Warhol and Levine. And at the sacrifice of forming their own families, each devoted their lives to mentoring students and supporting fellow artists instead. So how might their legacies be better appreciated, reviewed, or renewed? Well, step one, to give lectures like this. Step two, through publications like the ones that are over on the book table. Step three is to generate curated exhibitions of their work, as sort of myself and a number of others are doing. And step four, placement of works into foundations and museums. And most recently, sort of 3 of Anliker's works and 2 of Damer's have been acquired by the O'Brien Art Foundation in Pittsburgh. And so I'd like to thank all of these other people, and I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention. Thanks. So, any questions? Yes.
So this is sort of a bigger question, but as you were speaking, it made me think about the fact that we know higher education. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
We know that higher education following World War II expands dramatically, right? Then we
Yes.
have the GI Bill bringing people in. And it makes me wonder, because you've made such a great point here, that these 2 individuals could pursue these careers because basically they had a teaching practice that could
Yes.
put the roof over their heads.
Yes.
Which then makes me wonder about the other Anliker and Dahmers of the world that are out there who built these careers in the 70s and 80s because they could pursue technical innovation, pursue these things while not having to worry
Yes.
so much about gallery representation.
Yes.
And I just wonder if there's a broader phenomenon
Yes.
that we need to
Well,
be.
I could only speak of what I know, but they did have what I would call the luxury of the time they were in, that they could do that. Now, in the era that we're in of the adjunct professor, the 1-year contract, and all of that, it's sort of few people have that luxury. Marcel Duchamp, across the street, down the road a piece, he had the luxury of having a father who would underwrite sort of whenever he needed a loan, he could call his dad or write him and say, from my inheritance, will you please advance me 5,000 francs? And his father, being a notary, he kept a ledger for all of his children, and he kept, deducting sort of like how much they had already gotten. And then when he died, the accounts were settled. But that gave Duchamp the luxury of being able to say, I'm against commercialism, and I only want to do what I want to do. That plus teaching French lessons, enabled him to do that. So we're the beneficiaries of these things. And, I would encourage sort of other scholars, as much as it's interesting to talk about artists we already know, to see who you can find that we don't know who actually were worthwhile in contributing to the larger scene. When I did the Imagery with Chess show 20 years ago, I found that there were a number of artists that had slipped off the radar who made work that was very important and very important to these other artists. And so, that's been, my career has been like, who haven't you seen? What don't you already know about? And so that's my little bit. And, I would encourage others to consider that, and as you're looking around the world. But anyway, thank you for that question. Yes?
You mentioned the Anliker Foundation. Is there a body of work or an estate in which these are all grouped?
There is an estate of Roger Anliker. And, like 5 years or so ago, I was approached by some people who admired Jack Damer's work. And he is a lifelong bachelor. He's 85. He's in awful physical health. And any day I fear getting a phone call that he will be gone. And because he didn't bother to sell work, really, he showed work in these juried big shows, but it wasn't about selling things. He has a 3-story house that from the attic to the basement is all print drawers. with beautiful work. And, just the 200-page book that we did, it was a battle to winnow down to only 200 pages worth of beautiful things. And so we used this book to sort of focus him. And so now we're trying to focus him on creating an estate or foundation before perish the thought he, cycles off the mortal coil. But otherwise, there's going to be a gigantic dumpster fire in Madison, which would be very tragic. But yeah, it's a very good point, and something for all artists as they approach their golden years to consider. Yeah. So thank you once again.